The question about freebie culture has emerged once again. Now, recently, Prime Minister Modi, during a speech, talked about the political culture in India of distributing freebies or sweetmeats. The Hindi term he used was revadi. He talked about how these freebies are promised very often before elections, and it's a culture which should be avoided. The truth of the matter, though, is that there is no political party immune from the freebie culture. We hear large promises, larger than life, big promises every time before the election, and many political parties, when they do come to power, are compelled to go ahead with these. Now, public interest litigation has been filed in the Supreme Court questioning this political practice, saying it could lead India to a situation of economic crisis like Sri Lanka. The Supreme Court has asked the centre for its response. Now, even as those proceedings will continue, the next hearing is on August 3rd, we thought this is a good opportunity to look at this political practice and the impact it's having on the finances, especially of states. To speak on this, I am joined today by ET Now consulting editor Mythili Bhusnurmath, and I am also speaking today with Yamini Aiyar, President of the Centre for Policy Research. Welcome to both of you, and thank you so much for speaking with us today on the India Development Debate on an issue which is even more pertinent in the current economic situation. Ms. Yamini Aiyar, let me begin with your take. The culture of freebies is perhaps as old as Indian democracy. Is it becoming more unaffordable now for the state exchequer, and is that the real problem?
No, I think the real problem is with the nature of the Indian economy and the nature of the structural transformation that the Indian economy embarked on since 1991. Even in our peak growth years, we were not an economy that was necessarily able to provide high-quality jobs or even low-quality jobs, with the exception perhaps of the construction sector, to the vast majority of Indians. And as a consequence, economic participation in growth has been limited to the top 1%. This, in effect, creates a political context in which the need for what you're calling freebies, what I would prefer to call welfare support, social safety nets, as essential for the vast tracts of the Indian economy that are not able to participate in economic activity in a manner that is income generating and that enables social mobility. A second thing to recognize is the word freebies, I think, is quite misleading, because there is welfare and there is welfare. One of the challenges with the Indian economy, if you look over the period of the 30-year arc since the economy liberalized in 1991, is that while perhaps all the way through till the late 2000s, early 2010 phase, the Indian economy with growth was able to lift a vast majority of Indians out of extreme poverty. 50% of India remained in the frame of what the World Bank has described as a vulnerable population, which means one income shock and you get pushed back into poverty. Creating a sustainable income generating economy for this 50% with appropriate social safety nets that gave them the cushion to take risks was crucial. And I think that the Indian economy across political regimes has completely and entirely failed to do this. And therefore, the state and our politics has taken the route of what economist Ratan Roy calls very evocatively the compensatory state, and I call a compensatory politics. It is a politics that has generated on the back of a failure of building an economy that works for all of India, and therefore political pressures in a democracy require politicians to respond to the needs of all citizens, not just
fair enough, Yamini, but I think it's important to make a distinction, and you said this yourself, there is welfare and then there is welfare. So maybe the basic parameters of health, nutrition, education, etc. do require and should have state subsidy. But in the recent past, do you think that we are going overboard, and some states are going overboard? Hefty promises made, for example, to the agricultural class without any income definition. Free electricity has become another hot favorite. Now, all of these are very clearly being done with the idea of getting votes and votes alone. Do you think that's okay right now?
So I think that there are two very important things to remember. Number one, the Indian state and all our politicians have resoundingly failed in spending on those public goods that they should, like health and education. Overall, our expenditure on these crucial subjects is far lower than any comparable country at levels of GDP that India has. So problem number one is we just don't spend on all of the right things. So yes, there is, as a consequence, for a whole host of reasons, a lot of political incentive to spend on the easier things, which are these free subsidies that you described. But the need and urgency to do more of this, in my view, is coming from an overall economic situation, which is creating political pressure. And so we are in a vicious cycle. We are today paying the consequences of failures of the past. I will also say there are good economic arguments to go back to the subsidy list and identify what subsidies are being given as subsidies that could be reduced, including, but not exclusively, but including tax freedoms that are being given to certain kinds of industry. However, it's also important for us to understand and recognize that political processes are part and parcel of the nature of democracy, and we can't just assume that it is the role of the Supreme Court to be telling our politicians how to manage a political process in a democracy. It is perfectly politically legitimate for politicians to respond to signals that they are getting from voters. If we don't like it, we can have more arguments like this, but it is not the remit of the court. And I find it quite troubling about the state of our democracy that a PIL had to go to the courts to ask and answer this question, whereas it is a genuine outcome of a democratic process, which can be stopped if we don't like it as voters through debates and deliberation of this nature.
You know, so that's an interesting point you make. Kapil Sibal, who happened to be in the court during this hearing and was asked to give his views, has said, let the Finance Commission come in and peg some of their allocations to states based on the performance of their subsidies. So, of course, a lot more debate left to go there. But it's given us an opportunity to talk about the state of the economy and especially of states, the finances of states. So, Mythili, let me bring you in here. The big, I would say, news point and the worry is that is the state of the economy and especially state finances in some of our states so dire that questions about whether they will follow the Sri Lanka pattern are beginning to emerge. And another similarity with the Sri Lanka pattern was the giving out of subsidies / freebies that they could ill afford. Is that question a very relevant one for us right now?
Well, the question of the comparison of subnational governments in India with Sri Lanka doesn't arise at all, simply because states in India are not free to borrow if they have any debt at all to the center. That's written into the constitution. So there's no question of subnational governments or state governments in India going the Sri Lanka way. But yes, more and more state governments are giving more and more subsidies and freebies, as you call them. And this is competitive federalism of the worst kind, especially when you have very frequent elections. But economists distinguish between subsidies and two types, as merit and non-merit subsidies. Merit subsidies are those where you have a larger public good, like in the case of, say, education, health, sanitation, because when you give a subsidy even to one section of the population, it benefits everybody. But all other subsidies are typically taken as non-merit subsidies. And this really is a worry that non-merit subsidies in the country as a percentage of GDP are growing. Particularly, and also between states, there are some states which tend to offer much more by way of subsidies and some which give less. Yes, in the run-up to the elections, and this is true, let me say, across all political parties. So while the center and the Prime Minister has condemned this practice, the fact is that all political parties are guilty of offering freebies. The suggestion of Kapil Sibal that the Finance Commission looks into it is not quite a right one, simply because the Finance Commission looks at only tax revenues, the distribution between the center and the states, and the horizontal distribution between the states. So, and that is recommendatory in nature. The fact is that all governments have accepted the recommendations, but the point is you need something that is not recommendatory, but in which all states participate. This is where I think something like the Interstate Council, which is a body which is enshrined in the Constitution, Article 263 of the Constitution does allow for the setting up of an interstate council. Unfortunately, in India, we have not made much use of this. That is a right body where all political parties, all state governments come together, sit down at the common table, like in the case of the GST Council, and arrive at an understanding that we all need to be more responsible.
But Mythili, the thing is, it's political competitiveness, isn't it? I mean, the manifestos are not really taken seriously when they're published before elections, but the kind of promises made do impact the outcome one way or the other. So if I just take the example of one party, the Aam Aadmi Party, their model of a promise of free electricity up to a certain number of units has of course continued to work in Delhi, worked in Punjab, and that is a promise they've made as they're pitching for the Gujarat state elections. Now, something like that, would you say it is a necessary subsidy and a response to the requirement of the time, or does this come into the category of freebies that could eventually hurt the economy?
Well, it's completely a freebie if it's done without any relationship at all to income levels. Even below a certain income level, at least the cost you must recoup. The fact is that, we like to blame political parties, Tamanna, but what are we as voters doing? Why do we vote in these same political parties, the same people who keep offering these freebies? If only the electorate would wake up and realize that there is this huge intergenerational equity issue, debt to GDP ratio, there is no free lunch at the end of it all. So ultimately, until we mature as a democracy and all of us voters, whether it is identity politics or the freebie politics, I think there is a duty cast on every citizen of India also not to fall victim to this kind of freebie culture. Unfortunately, if political parties fail, so do we as voters.
So, not to just talk about one political party, well, even before the Uttar Pradesh elections, there were very generous promises made by the Yogi Adityanath government, and they came back to power. So, Yamini, it's clearly across all party lines. There is no reason why political parties would stop, is it? Or even want to distinguish between, subsidies which are necessary and those which are excessive and ill-afforded?
Well, I mean, I do think that a lot of the attraction towards freebies is also symptomatic of the challenges that political parties themselves see vis-a-vis the economy and their ability to provide long-lasting jobs and genuine income generation for the last citizen as well as the first citizen. But I think I completely agree with every single thing that Mythili said. I just want to add two more points to this that we should consider. One very crucial thing, while state budgets post-COVID in particular are looking, if you look at the debt to GSDP ratios and the latest RBI report points to this, are looking very vulnerable. It is important for us to also recognize that two of the reasons why they are vulnerable, one, because they were left to the vagaries of the market for borrowing in peak COVID rather than getting a devolution formula-based grant from the center, which would have supported them, and the cess compensation, GST cess is part and parcel of that. But even predating COVID, the Uday scheme, which was imposed on states from the government of India, made state governments quite vulnerable. If you actually look at fiscal deficit ratios for state governments, they were within the requirements of FRBM up until the full impact of Uday was visible, which then coupled on to a slowing economy combined with the shock of COVID. So the central government, for all its claims about reveries, etc., needs to also recognize what role it is playing in making state governments and state budgets vulnerable to the kind of challenges that you are sort of articulating by making this a not quite equitable comparison between Sri Lanka and states, but the challenge of state budgets looking vulnerable and yet political freebies being an attractive incentive. So fiscal management of states requires a lot of cooperation between center and states, and that perhaps again is something that the Finance Commission should not do, but the Interstate Council should probably look at. But ultimately, in my view, the contract that is being forged, as Mythili was pointing to, between the voter who is voting for the freebies and the freebies being presented by political parties is, I think, an outcome of a vicious cycle of a failure to invest in core human capital and economic growth trajectory that grew of parts of the economy that didn't necessarily trickle down to all of the economy, where at best we were able to generate large-scale employment through construction, but we still haven't fixed the manufacturing problem. And we are now looking at even greater challenges in the economy with lowering female labor force participation. Ultimately, an economic imagination will be able to roll in sensible versions of what you call freebies, where perhaps, to even the electricity thing in Delhi, there is free electricity at the lower end of the spectrum, and then there is There are graded structures of pay at higher ends of spectrum. So sensible versions of freebies can be worked out to be able to empower the lowest level of the economy to participate in the economy. But it ought to be part of an economic discussion. Right now, it is only part of a political discussion or a political contract that is, in my view, a consequence of a failed economic imagination.
And also maybe some of these schemes need to have a system where they are reviewed periodically on whether they are still valid, are they reaching the right people efficiently or not, etc., so that they don't go on into perpetuity, that once a scheme has been announced, it can just not be rolled back. But thank you so much, Yamini Aiyar and Mythili Bhusnurmath, for, I think, what is a very important conversation to have at this point in time. Thank you.
Thank you.